Hey everyone, thanks for joining us on a special edition of the Week in Review. I'm Amanda Vinicky. Hope you had a very happy Thanksgiving. On tonight's program, we're looking to the future and what a potential impact a second Trump administration could have on Illinois. He could be playing chicken, or well, turkey, but President-elect Donald Trump says higher tariffs are coming with the nation's top trading partners on day one.
I said I'm going to put a 100, 200, or 300. I'm going to put the highest tariff in history, meaning I'm going to stop them from ever selling a car into the United States.
What that could mean for the local economy. Chicago would also see an impact if Trump's border czars plans come to fruition.
There is going to be a mass deportation because we just finished a mass illegal immigration crisis on the border.
Illinois leaders are preparing when it comes to immigration, abortion, and the environment.
Illinois will continue to be a refuge for those whose rights are being denied elsewhere. Women seeking reproductive health care, immigrants searching to work hard for a better life, LGBTQ Americans looking for welcome and protection.
Meanwhile, Chicago has a month left to get a budget passed. And now to our Week in Review Thanksgiving panel. Joining us are some very familiar and fabulous faces. We've turkey trotted out the team of Heather Sharon, Nick Blumberg, Fatty Wetley, and Joanna Hernandez. We should also note, by the way, that we are recording this program just ahead of the holiday. Let's get to it because by the time this airs, folks are going to presumably be having their credit cards and wallets out. Black Friday, small Saturday shopping, and this comes as President-elect Trump has promised to impose sweeping tariffs on Mexico, Canada, and China right at the start of his presidency. Nick, if he does do this, what impact is that going to have in Illinois?
Well, the concern, on a day-to-day basis for the folks out doing Black Friday shopping or who are just back from it is that it's going to make a lot of everyday consumer goods a lot more expensive. But it could have also, some pretty significant impacts on some of the big industries here in Illinois. There's the expectation that, car assembly plants that we have, several of here in Illinois and throughout the Midwest, that it's going to be more expensive for car makers. Auto stocks have seen, some tumbles after these announcements, after these sorts of threats. There's also the threat of something like a retaliatory tariff. During the first Trump administration, China put a tariff on soybeans, and Illinois is regularly the most productive soybean grower in the United States. So, it's not just a question of do things become more expensive, it's also a question of do, Illinoisans, does the agriculture, kind of get hosed in the process here too? Well,
and there's such a rolling impact because, of course, if you have fewer people perhaps buying cars because they can't afford them, then that comes with jobs.
I was just going to say that Chicago could also be sort of the worst case scenario for gas prices rising because a lot of oil that is transformed into gasoline and then sold in Chicago comes from Canada, which means that would be a more expensive process if those tariffs do go into effect. And that, of course, will hit people squarely in the pocketbook because, as the economists say, the demand for gas is inelastic because you have to get to work, you have to get your kids to school. So that could be a big right-away impact for Chicagoans.
I also want to mention that the U.S. has a big motor company in Mexico. So what would that look like? I mean, the President Claudia Sheinbaum, she's even said, okay, put a tariff. I'm going to put a tariff back on you. Mm-hmm. Right. And she's even mentioned that what's the point of putting a tariff on a company like a motor company that's been in Mexico for 80 years? You're going to cause inflation and you're going to cause loss of jobs for the United States and Mexico. So
I think to Nick's point, what we learned in the pandemic too was that global supply chain. Yep. And like you were mentioning, so many of the parts or the components for what we think of as American-made products are coming from overseas. So how does that help?
Assembled in the U.S.
Yeah, they're assembled in the U.S., but the parts are coming from someplace else. So how does that work?
It'll be interesting as well because, the president has some authority to essentially unilaterally impose tariffs, for national security reasons, other justifications, things like that. But there are folks in Congress, including Republicans, who have talked over the years about reining that authority. And it'll be interesting to see whether, if these tariffs go into place, if some of, Illinois' Congress people, even their Republican Congress people say, hey, slow down, this is not actually helping a lot of the folks who helped put Trump back in office.
Well, to that end, we know that Trump was elected in part because Americans were so frustrated about inflation, just the price of going shopping, buying eggs, buying a car. What impact? I mean, why would he be pursuing this if he was elected on the basis of promising that he was going to bring down inflation when tariffs, it seems, are going to, from all economists' predictions, do the very opposite?
Well, it is a best case scenario for a tariff is that it encourages companies to bring manufacturing back into the United States. And the idea is that if it's too expensive to bring manufactured goods into the country, companies will just decide to make them here, and that will sort of set off what they hope will be a virtuous circle of prices sort of remaining stable, but more jobs being created. And it's just not clear that that is how this all works out.
You just have to assume you have a factory ready made for that good to be produced.
Or maybe short-term pain, long-term gain.
Right.
Well, we've also heard the president-elect say that China and Mexico and Canada would pay these tariffs, and that's just not how it works. These are not sort of charges that one country makes to another country. It's what you charge companies to bring their goods into the country. Now, if I'm, not in business, I'm a political reporter, but if it costs me more to bring something to sell in America, I'm going to charge Americans more to cover those costs because I'm not in the business of losing money. At least I don't think I would be if I was a business person.
I think you'd be pretty good.
Yeah. So there are a lot of unknowns, and of course we're back in this place where we were at the beginning of 2017, where everybody's not quite sure if we should take the president-elect seriously or literally or symbolically.
He could just be talking. Once it goes into effect, or then it's like, oh, that didn't do what I thought it would. Now I'm unpopular. I roll it back. But what you were saying about it's not just going to be Canadian companies or Mexican companies. I just heard, the president or CEO of IKEA saying, these tariffs now, we could be starting to have to charge more.
Yeah, and one of the things we've heard from, the presumptive Commerce Secretary nominee is that these can be, both a source of revenue, this extra import tax, as well as a bargaining chip. But always the question with bargaining is, okay, what do you hope to achieve here? If it's that, you're damaging relationships with our, two closest trading partners with whom we share a border, if you're putting these things into place that potentially have, as you say, long-term gain but short-term pain, does that damage you electorally? Does that damage, or at least complicate the United States' position on the world stage? So it could be a bargaining chip, but we don't necessarily have a clear idea of what the strategy is here.
Let's hone in some more on the impact on Illinois, because something that Illinois has spent a lot of money on is the electric vehicle industry, really trying to pump it up, manufacturing here. And sort of related to the tariff question, or at least tangentially so, is that the president-elect wants to undo the federal tax credits that go to folks who buy an EV. What impact could that have on companies such as Rivian?
Well, you could see, at least in the short term, sort of a run on electric vehicles. There's been some, pretty good reporting done that folks are really interested right now in buying an EV and taking advantage of that tax credit. But absolutely,
get it while you can.
Yeah, exactly. But absolutely, if demand is diminished because folks aren't getting that $7,500, that could, certainly have some downstream effects on Rivian. There's also the question of, some of the environmental regulations on EVs, which, Trump has said he wants to roll back these kind of Biden-era efficiency standards, which have been meant to, make car manufacturers push them towards EVs, push them towards cleaner vehicles. Trump wants to roll that back. Interestingly, the auto industry has sort of said, look, we need stability, we need certainty about
We've
these
already
rules.
Invested in these plans
exactly.
and these changes. Patty?
That's almost everything, though, when you think about this, and I've been thinking about this a lot in terms of climate change and the environment and just kind of the whiplash effect that people are having, and then you can't plan. It's, one administration it's this, the other one you're swinging the opposite
Lots of
way.
executive orders
it's just
rolled
like
back.
too much chaos. I'm thinking about something like, let's say, the EPA. Now they're talking about wanting to gut the EPA again. You gut it, you lose everybody, then you've got a bunch of people who need to come up to speed really quickly, and then you gut it again, and it's just, you're losing institutional knowledge, you're just constantly, nobody knows which way the wind is blowing. It's just kind of too much chaos. But in terms of the electric vehicles, have we heard, is Illinois going to try to do like what California did, where let's put this in place and we'll give you, but Does Illinois have?
Already does have some tax credits, but
even more money
you're having, and I think we're going to get to this in just a bit. In fact, let's go there right now. In terms of the finances that the state and the city depend on the federal government.
Yes.
So Illinois already actually giving some tax credits for electric vehicle purchases, but doesn't perhaps have the money to make up what the federal legislation calls for. And so in general, we have the expectation from the governor that Trump is going to target Chicago, Illinois, some of these more Democratic-led states and cities. How could Trump make things difficult for Chicago and Heather?
There's really just a plethora of ways that he could make Chicago's life harder. So Chicago relies on federal grants in any number of ways. They use federal grants to pay for police. They use federal grants to fund affordable housing. They use federal grants to improve roads and bridges and all sorts of sort of infrastructure. Now, the Trump administration during his first term tried to do something very similar. They said, look, if you don't revoke your self-proclaimed sanctuary city status, we're going to take these law enforcement grants that you give away. And that ultimately, the city sued the federal government over that. That case went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the city won. So there are some protections sort of still in place left over from that court fight, but that was not, that was a sort of a halting effort. And we heard the newly appointed border czar saying that they were going to launch a mass deportation issue. And there's really no way to do that without targeting cities like Chicago, New York City, Denver, Los Angeles. And to do that, you're going to run directly into governors like J.B. Pritzker and mayors like Brandon Johnson, who have said, we will protect our residents whether or not they are undocumented.
How does that complicate things as you have both Chicago and then the state soon thereafter having budget discussions? What can they count on from the federal government?
Nothing.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Easy enough answer. You want to say anything more, or should we leave it at that?
No, I mean, I was actually doing kind of a deep dive into some of the environmental funding, and it's the same thing. The federal government does a lot of matching grants for a lot of habitat restoration projects, or, you know, cleaning up brownfields and things like that. And a lot of times it's, you know, you come with this much money, we'll match with this much money. I don't know how many environmental organizations have the funds to do a lot of the things that we would be surprised have had federal dollars attached to them. You look at that beautiful restoration of, you know, Illinois Beach State Park, or the Burnham Wildlife Corridor in Chicago. Like, there's federal dollars in so many places. And if you decide to make some of that go away, but I would say in the case of, I was thinking about the Great Lakes, you have states like Michigan and Wisconsin and Indiana that are very important electorally. So do you want to sort of peeve off those states, and maybe Illinois kind of sneaks in with our buddies there and keeps that funding coming?
You know, I wonder if he, that's what I wonder if he can do that. I mean, just thinking about like, withholding federal funds, right? Especially when the Trump administration, they transition and basically saying we're going to hold the largest deportation that the country has seen. So let's say like Chicago, Governor Pritzker and Mayor, like, hey, we're not going to help you. What is that going to look like? Can they withhold these federal funds?
It's an open question. And I think that the other sort of potential that, could sort of protect Illinois and protect Chicago is that the Republicans only have the narrowest of margins in the House, which means that even a single Republican, not voting for it could sort of thwart efforts to sort of pass sort of a purely Republican piece of legislation. And of course that the Democrats could still filibuster in the Senate, which means there will have to be some level of compromise on legislation. The issue is what Trump can do unilaterally through executive order. And it's just not clear sort of how far the courts will allow him to push those boundaries, sort of what will be upheld, and honestly what will be the collateral damage in the meantime.
And there are also potentially backstops in place depending on the source of the federal funding, how it flows through. A lot of this money goes directly to states. It's what I mean. So it's all these different sorts of programs where it's allotted out based on need or based on population, depending on what you're looking at.
A formula that has long been in place.
Exactly. And then there's also the Congress, because we talk about federal dollars as though it's sort of floating out there in the ether. Federal dollars are our tax dollars, and they flow through back to lawmakers, states, and districts. So even Republican lawmakers, there are plenty of federal grant programs that they will defend.
Benefiting their districts.
Yeah, it's to benefit. If there's a program that helps build build a new bridge or pave a, a highway in their, home state or district, they're likely going to be in favor of that because it is of benefit to their constituents. It benefits the local economy. So that's a potential backstop there as well, especially with those super narrow majorities.
Well, and you do have, however, a minority of Illinois' delegation that goes to D.C. made up of members of Trump's own party, just 3 members. So, Nick, what can you share there in terms of how important they might be in bringing home money to the state? And these are all, by the way, folks that represent more the southern part of the region. So what does that mean for residents of Chicago and the suburbs?
Well, I think that's, again, sort of an open question, because if you're the 3 Republican members of the Illinois delegation, yeah, they are likely to be maybe talking again about tariffs, pushing back on some of those ideas because a lot of their, constituents are in agriculture and do rely on things like growing soybeans for their, to get by. There's also the question of, Representative Mary Miller is aligned with the, far-right Freedom Caucus, which was...
And aligned closely with Trump.
Exactly. But, the Freedom Caucus was a thorn in the side of former Speaker, Kevin McCarthy, eventually helped lead to his ouster. They've been a thorn in the side of current House Speaker Mike Johnson. So there's both the question of, can some of these folks push back on, initiatives from the Trump administration that they see as damaging to their constituents? They could be, if they are successfully, those votes are successfully whipped, they could be a part of that very narrow majority. Right now it's looking like the Democrats have picked up just 2 seats in the House, so eating into that even further. And yeah, it's a potential that they could play, or at least, one of them could play an obstructionist role in the Congress.
Joanna, we touched briefly on this notion of mass deportation. As you noted, the president-elect has promised the largest mass deportation in history. When you are doing reporting, what are you hearing from Chicago residents about that?
I think there's so many different opinions, and I think the main thing that I find surprising is obviously we know there has been an uptake of Latino supporters who support Trump, right? And it's so interesting because I had a recent conversation with somebody. He's been here for a year. He's from Venezuela. He's a Venezuelan refugee. And he was so adamant that Trump was only going to send back criminals with criminal records. So I think there's like this new message that he is only going to be targeting people of criminal records, but they've never said that. They haven't ruled out sending, separating families or sending, children back or separating them from their families. But I think that's like the really interesting notion that's happening right now with the people who support Trump and the people who are like immigration advocates, lawyers who are trying to prepare for what this mass deportation.
What preparations are they making?
Well, many of them are talking to their clients, of course, in workshops, really trying to make the people in Chicago or in Illinois feel comfortable with understanding what, their rights. And that's very important. I think that's something that we kind of saw back in 2017. We saw ICE raids. We saw families being teared apart. We know what that looks like. So I think at this moment they're preparing for that and really making sure that people are empowered and know their rights.
And Patty, you also touched earlier on the environment, but I want to go back to that because as our guru of all things nature, the president, of course, has gone back to that chant that we heard from him when he first was making a run for the White House of drill, baby, drill. What impact do things like that have on nature? Even that's, of course, far away from Illinois, but are you looking at what could happen, say, in the Great Lakes by a turnover at the EPA?
Sure. Again, they're sort of the overarching organization over all this money that flows into Great Lakes states. So you wonder about what happens with protections for threatened or invasive species, but I would have to say, even when you have administrations like in Illinois that, skew heavily Democratic, that doesn't mean that we didn't still destroy Belle Bowl Prairie to, promote an airport expansion. So I feel like environmental advocates are used to constantly having to fight for nature. So whether it's rolling back regulations on pollutants or, narrowing the definition of what a wetland can be considered, it's not like my inbox over the last 4 years hasn't constantly been flooded with action alerts, it's where's the Bears going to build their new stadium? It's just kind of a constant, but I think the concern is that, there's no break. no brake pedal, the gloves are off, everything is just free and clear to take us backwards. And, you know, I would say that even globally we're seeing that economic interests constantly take precedence over the environment. I don't think anybody is really making a whole ton of progress toward cutting their emissions and, you know, making those goals that was going to be for 2030, then 35, then 50. So I think the concern is that we're just never making that forward progress that we need. And every time we take a tiny inch forward, it's a bigger step backward. So I think those are some of the biggest concerns. But we have great conservation organizations in the Chicago region. Like, people here love their forest preserves. They're very mobilized. They, you know, they get the job done. But unfortunately, for too long, we have been relying on nonprofits, volunteers to maintain some of our best natural resources, and it just gets exhausting.
And, you know, I want to move on now to, we've talked about the election, of course, and we know that Trump is going to be in the White House come January. But we also finally have election results finalized from the city of Chicago, for example. And Heather, they are telling.
They are. So for the first time, Republican won a Chicago ward, the 41st ward on the very northwest corner of the city. Trump won by less than 2 percentage points, so about the margin nationally in the popular vote. And I think it's an indication that in those sort of people who are sort of moving perhaps a little bit from the center to the center right, but I think the larger story is the drop in turnout. And if you talk about the drop in turnout, you know, you're talking about fewer Democratic voters coming out. And I think that was really the tale of the Chicago election results. And, you know, so back 4 years ago, it was almost more than 74% of the vote. This year, it was less than 70% of the votes. And that is, you know, tens of thousands of people who decided not to vote. And I think something that the Democratic Party locally and nationally are trying to figure out is, why didn't those people come out to vote? And that meant that in wards like the 22nd ward and the 25th ward, you saw sort of Trump expand his margin over the 2020 vote. The question that I don't know the answer to is, does that indicate a rising level of support for Trump, or is it because fewer Democratic voters came out? And I think we have to be very careful when we sort of draw those conclusions, because I think if you're sort of a political operative, or if you're somebody who's interested, you would sort of address those problems differently. And I think that there's a great peril that both parties, both Republicans and Democrats, will learn the wrong lessons from this election.
You've never done that before.
No. And I think because, you know, it's dangerous, as, you know, Joanna, to say, well, there's been a huge surge of support for Trump among Latino Chicagoans. Well, certainly the margin is different, right? But what is that actually telling us? And does that mean that they favor sort of a tough immigration crackdown?
You can't get at the why. You can get at the what, you know how they voted, but the why.
And 4 years to figure this out. We have about a minute left, and I wanted to get to, you know, we have a minute left in the show, but a month left of 2024. So what has to happen still in this calendar year? Nick, I'm going to begin with you.
It's not quite by the end of the calendar year necessarily, but we are waiting on final approval for the red line extension that the CTA is planning to the far south side. They need nearly $2 billion in federal money, and they are saying they are hurrying to get that done before President Biden leaves office, and they sound pretty confident.
Heather.
Chicago needs a budget. The state deadline is December 31st, and there is no clear path to an agreement to fill the city's massive budget deficit. So everybody's going to come back on Monday and try to put their nose to the grindstone.
In the last 10 seconds, do either of you have something you're looking for?
I mean, my eyes are just going to be on how the city continues to mobilize to help the immigration population here. I mean, again, we have thousands of people. Besides the 50,000 new arrivals who are here, we still have thousands of others who are undocumented here, been waiting to be citizens. So my eyes will be on that.
Well, and that is going to be our last word. Thank you so much. Yes, we are out of time. Our thanks to Heather Sharon, Nick Blumberg, Patty Wetley, and to Joanna Hernandez. We will be back to wrap things up right after this.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by the Alexandra and John Nichols family. The Polk Brothers Foundation. Additional support is provided by
And that is our show for this Friday night. Check out our email newsletter, The Daily Chicagoan, for more on what you need to know about the complicated issues facing the city. But no, we do not stop there. We also introduce you to new ways to explore your neighborhood and those around you with concert recommendations, weekend activities, and more. Let me tell you, some holiday fun coming up in the Daily Chicagoan. You can find that at WTTW.com/newsletter. For the Week in Review, I'm Amanda Vinicky. Thanks for watching. Again, we are very grateful for all of you. Now, Patty, I wanted to get back to you because we didn't get to share what you were looking to cap off 24.
That big Great Lakes Restoration Initiative funding, which has pumped like $4 billion into Great Lakes in like the last 10 years, is up for reauthorization, and it's kind of just sitting there. So I'll be interested to see if that gets re-upped for like another 5 years, and those are really critical funds.
And of course, the Bears will have played on Thanksgiving Day, so beyond their stats, what about 2024 and the prospects for them?
For the Bears?
For the team moving the stadium, not their
I mean, is it going to be the Michael Reese Hospital site? Is it going to be a new stadium
When does
on the
this have to be
lakefront?
decided?
So, I mean, when do they have the money? If they have the money, they can start building.
Why does nobody ever say, why do we need a new stadium?
Yeah,
No, they want a roof so they can get the Super Bowl, but they also want a lot of money from Springfield, and good luck with that, as Amanda knows well.
They're not getting any of
That's going to be the story of 2025. Early on.
I know. Let's talk about their winning track record. So how are they supposed to get the money?
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a Chicago personal injury and wrongful death firm that is proud to recognize its 20 attorneys recognized in the 2025 edition of the Best Lawyers in America.